This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. Beneath the golden dust of Mesopotamia, where rivers once whispered to the gods and ziggurats pierced the sky like the spines of divine beasts, there lies a silence that does not forget. Babylon, the city of wonders, of towering myths, of kings crowned in blood and stone, did not fall in a moment. It unraveled in shadows, betrayal by betrayal, lie by lie. What remains in textbooks is neat, a Persian conquest, swift and bloodless. But that story is clean because it was written by victors. The truth? The truth is knotted, bruised, buried under the weight of shattered tablets and vanished tongues. It begins not with Cyrus at the gates, but in the hearts of Babylon's own priests. Betrayed, temples emptied, a people divided. Why did a city that once defied gods and time itself surrender without a cry? Who whispered open the gates? And why did the world's most radiant power crumble in a single night? There are scrolls that speak of hunger, omens, prophecy, and others, burned before their words could scream. This is not just the fall of a city. It is the quiet murder of an empire. And what history ignored, we will now exhume bone by bone, name by forgotten name. Long before its fall, Babylon had begun to rot from within. The outer walls still stood firm, massive, indomitable, glazed in blue tiles and crowned with images of lions and bulls, but inside those walls, something deeper was crumbling. For centuries, Babylon had ruled as the jewel of Mesopotamia, a city that did not just exist, but declared itself immortal, with every brick laid by the hands of kings and slaves alike. It was here that Hammurabi once carved law into stone, where Nebuchadnezzar raised the hanging gardens if they existed, and where Marduk, chief of gods, was honored in rituals that bound the heavens to the earth. But by the time Cyrus dreamed of conquest, Babylon had become brittle. King Nabonidus, the last to wear the crown, was not beloved by the priests. He abandoned the city for years to worship a desert moon god, Sin, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his stead. The priests of Marduk, keepers of tradition and power, saw this as sacrilege. The people grew anxious. Grain supplies dwindled, and oracles whispered warnings in the dark. The walls might have withstood siege for 20 years, but it was not battering rams that Cyrus needed. It was silence, apathy, fatigue. The fall of Babylon did not begin with the enemy outside. It began with the faith unraveling within. 2. Understand how Babylon, the very axis around which the ancient world once spun, fell without the shriek of a final battle. One must peer into the soul of its final king. Nabonidus was no ordinary monarch. He was a mystic, a builder, a man obsessed with omens and forgotten gods. From the moment he took the throne, he turned away from Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity, and instead exalted Sin, the moon god worshipped. In the deserts of Haran, he withdrew to the oasis city of Timah for over a decade, leaving Belshazzar to govern a restless capital choked by ritual, drought, and spiritual confusion. This abandonment created a vacuum. The high priests of Marduk, who had long entwined themselves with the city's political machinery, seethed in silence. Without the rituals performed properly, they believed the covenant between Babylon and the gods was broken. The sacred New Year festival, where the king must publicly humble himself before Marduk to secure divine favor, was left undone. The stars above, once read as celestial assurances of Babylon's destiny, began to shift portents of doom, comets trailing like the swords of vengeful spirits. And into that spiritual void, rumors crept like smoke that a foreign king from the east one who claimed divine sanction, was coming not to destroy Babylon, but to liberate it from its own betrayal of the old gods. The great city, once united by faith and fire, now cracked like ancient clay under the weight of its own forgotten gods. In the twilight of Babylon's sovereignty, as the Euphrates shimmered under the weight of a dying empire, a whisper emerged from the east, a whisper bearing the name of Cyrus. Not yet the Great. Cyrus was a Persian king whose rise had been meteoric and shrouded in divine myth. He was a man said to be chosen by the gods, and not just Persian gods, but Marduk himself at least, according to later records etched by the victors. As Cyrus marched westward, swallowing Media, Lydia, and finally eyeing Babylon, he did not present himself as a conqueror, but as a restorer. His scribes would later inscribe on the famous Cyrus cylinder that Marduk had searched the earth for a righteous king to return justice to the city of his temple, and found him in Cyrus. This was more than propaganda. It was spiritual warfare. The priests of Babylon, abandoned by their own king, saw in Cyrus not a foreign threat, but a divine solution. They reached out in secret, forging letters, plotting rites, preparing for a handover masked as salvation. Meanwhile, inside Babylon, Belshazzar left as co-regent clung to power like a man gripping a sword with both hands as it cuts him open. He hosted feasts to mock the threat, to display divine favor, but even the wine soured. According to later chronicles, on the very night of Babylon's fall, he drank from sacred vessels stolen from Jerusalem's temple, and a ghostly hand wrote on the palace wall, Min, Tekel, Upharsin, numbered, weighed, and found wanting. It was not just a warning, it was a verdict. As autumn deepened in 539 BCE, the Persian army advanced with the quiet precision of inevitability, its soldiers hardened by years of relentless conquest. It was not swords that led them into Babylon. It was the river. The Euphrates, lifeblood of the city, ran through its walls, both a blessing and a fatal vulnerability. Cyrus's general, the brilliant and ruthless Gobryas, knew this. Under cover of night, his forces dug canals to divert the Euphrates, lowering the river's level until it no longer guarded the great bronze gates submerged beneath the walls. While Babylon feasted in complacency, the water receded like a dying breath. The Persians slipped beneath the wall's belly, no battering ram, no siege tower. A priest opened the inner gates. The chronicles would later call it bloodless, divine, inevitable. But that night, within the darkened palace halls, Belshazzar's screams echoed off walls once gilded with conquest. Some say he was slain in his sleep, others that he stood staring at the writing on the wall until the blade came. The city did not burn. There was no grand sack, and yet something died more thoroughly than if it had been raised. The Babylonian gods were dethroned without. A war cry. The city that once defied Assyria, that humbled kings and dictated calendars, fell in silence because its people had already surrendered long before the gates did. And Cyrus, draped in both steel and scripture, walked into Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a savior in the eyes of those who had turned against their own. The morning after Babylon fell was not marked by fire, but by ceremony. As the sun rose over Ishtar Gate, now guarded by foreign soldiers in disciplined silence, the city awoke to an uncanny calm. No looting, no screams, no smoke, only the heavy hush of a people unsure whether they had been conquered or delivered. Cyrus entered the city not with trumpets, but with precision. His soldiers ordered to spare the temples and respect the gods. It was a brilliant stroke, not of mercy, but of mastery. In proclaiming himself the liberator chosen by Marduk, Cyrus bypassed resistance and secured legitimacy. The priests, once marginalized under Nabonidus, now stood at the forefront, robes freshened, scrolls in hand, chanting the hymns of old with new zeal. They led Cyrus to the Esagila temple, where he performed the ancient rites Nabonidus had neglected. For the people, starved of ritual and frightened by omens, this was not an invasion. It was a return to divine order. But under this performance, a deeper conquest unfolded. Babylon's identity, once fiercely independent, began to blur. Persian scribes replaced Babylonian ones. The imperial language shifted. Though the walls stood, and the ziggurats still pierced the sky, the soul of the empire was already being rewritten. The fall was not in the sword, but in the script. The clay tablets now praised a foreign king. And so the most radiant city in the ancient world was not burned to ashes, it was embalmed, preserved by its conqueror, and hallowed from within. In the weeks that followed, Babylon wore its conquest like a borrowed robe draped in continuity, but stitched with foreign thread. Cyrus issued decrees in the name of peace and restoration, but each scroll carried the unmistakable scent of transformation. The famed Cyrus cylinder, often called the first declaration of human rights, was no mere benevolent gesture. It was a political talisman. Written in Babylonian cuneiform and placed in the temples, it proclaimed Cyrus as the chosen of Marduk, a restorer of sanctuaries, a bringer of justice. But it also encoded the erasure of Babylonian sovereignty. By allowing exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples, Cyrus fractured the old order of imperial centralization and replaced it with a federation loyal to Persia, not Babylon. The Babylonian elites, sensing which way the divine wind now blew, pledged their allegiance. The scribes inscribed praise for the foreign king with the same hands that once glorified Nebuchadnezzar. This was not resistance, it was recalibration. Beneath the surface, however, unease simmered. The merchant class fretted over new tax systems. The lower classes whispered of betrayal. But with the temples reopened and the rituals resumed, dissent was drowned beneath the rhythmic chants of Marduk's priests, now priests of empire. The transition was so smooth it looked holy. And yet, the old soul of Babylon, its pride, its independence, its place as the axis of the world, had already faded like ink left too long in the sun. Outside the palace walls and sacred courtyards, in the dust-choked alleys where the poor lit lamps of fish oil and told stories to keep the silence away. The fall of Babylon was not a ceremony, it was a wound. For generations, these people had endured under kings and gods, paying tribute in grain and blood, but the rhythms of their oppression were familiar, almost sacred. Now those rhythms were broken. New tax collectors arrived, speaking in unfamiliar dialect, inscribing decrees in Old Persian beside the once sacred cuneiform. The markets shifted. The great caravans that once poured through Babylon now flowed eastward toward Persepolis. The city, long a beating heart of trade, became a satellite, orbiting a new imperial sun. Foreign governors replaced native officials. Soldiers from Media, Persia, and Elam walked its streets, polite but armed, their presence a constant whisper of surveillance. Some of the poor fled to the countryside. Others waited for Babylon to rise again, to remember itself. But the memory faded with each passing season. Children born after Cyrus would not know a Babylon that ruled itself. The chants of the temple still rose, incense still burned, but the gods had changed allegiances, or had been changed by them. To the rulers, it was a peaceful occupation. To the priesthood, a divine restoration. But to the alley dwellers, the potters, the scribes with no patron, it was a quiet suffocation. A city that once declared itself eternal had not been destroyed, it had been rewritten. And in that rewriting, its soul had been excised with surgical care. The fall of Babylon also marked the twilight of the city's ancient wisdom knowledge, painstakingly accumulated over millennia, now slipping into shadows. Babylonian scholars, once masters of astronomy, mathematics, and divination, found their place diminished under Persian rule, though the Persians admired their learning and adopted much of it. The patrons who supported this scholarship changed. The Academy of Babylon, where scribes once debated the movement of stars and the fate of kings, lost funding and prestige as Persian centers of power in Pasargadae and Persepolis grew. Tablets containing star charts, omens, and medical recipes were locked away or relocated, slowly forgotten in dusty archives. More devastating was the loss of cultural identity. Babylonian myths and epic tales, once sung aloud in temples and marketplaces, were now overshadowed by the imperial narrative that glorified Cyrus and his lineage. The ancient stories of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, and Marduk's rise became distant echoes, footnotes in the grand history of Persia's rise. Yet some whispered resistance survived in secret scrolls, oral traditions passed beneath cloaks and behind closed doors, waiting for a time when Babylon would remember itself. Again, this intellectual eclipse was a slow death, less dramatic than fire or sword, but no less complete. Babylon did not fall in a day. It faded in centuries, swallowed by the tides of conquest and cultural erasure. Yet, amid the shadows of decline, the spirit of Babylon was not entirely extinguished. The city became a crucible of cultural synthesis, where Persian administration met Babylonian tradition, forging a new, hybrid identity. This fusion was most visible in the complex bureaucracy that governed the vast Achaemenid Empire. Babylonian scribes, with their mastery of cuneiform and record-keeping, found new purpose translating imperial decrees and managing tax registers. Temples once devoted solely to Babylonian gods began incorporating Persian deities and rituals, creating a religious tapestry as intricate as the city's famed mosaics. Festivals blended old and new, and in quiet corners, artisans crafted objects that married Mesopotamian symbolism with Persian motifs. But this was a double-edged sword. While it preserved aspects of Babylon's heritage, it also diluted its uniqueness, subsuming the city's identity within the vastness of empire. Babylon was no longer the radiant center of the world, but a vital yet diminished node in a sprawling imperial web. This transformation carried profound psychological weight for the Babylonian people, who wrestled with pride, loss, and adaptation. The city that had once dared to challenge gods now bowed to a foreign king whose name would echo through history as a liberator, but also as a conqueror who erased the past to build his future. In the midst of this transformation, the Babylonian priesthood emerged as both gatekeepers and negotiators of power. Though their influence had waned under Nabonidus and through the Conquest, they quickly adapted to the new regime. The priests understood that survival required embracing the Persian king as the legitimate ruler anointed by their own god, Marduk. They restored rituals and festivals with renewed zeal, carefully recasting Cyrus's arrival as the fulfillment of divine prophecy rather than a political defeat. This theological pivot was not mere spin. It was a strategy of survival that reshaped Babylon's religious landscape. Temples reopened their doors, sacrifices resumed, and priests wielded their influence to maintain social order and continuity. Amidst upheaval, however, this alignment came at a cost. The traditional autonomy of Babylon's religion was compromised, subordinated to imperial interests. The priesthood became intermediaries between an empire that demanded loyalty and a populace that longed for its lost sovereignty. Behind closed doors, whispered debates raged. Was this pragmatic collaboration or spiritual capitulation? The very god who had once embodied Babylon's might now became a symbol co-opted to justify foreign rule. This complex dance of power, faith, and identity shaped the city's destiny in ways history often overlooks, revealing that the fall of Babylon was not only a military event, but a profound spiritual and cultural metamorphosis. Meanwhile, the wider world watched Babylon's fall with a mix of fear, fascination, and opportunism. To the Egyptians, long rivals and occasional allies, the Persian conquest was a harbinger of shifting tides. Pharaohs sent envoys, uncertain whether to resist or negotiate, knowing that the mighty city that had once ruled Mesopotamia was no longer untouchable. In the Mediterranean, Greek city-states recorded rumors of Cyrus's mercy and strategy, tales that would later influence their own concepts of rulership and empire. Yet beneath the surface diplomacy, alliances fractured and recalibrated. Babylon's demise reverberated through trade networks stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, as merchants adjusted to new rulers and shifting borders. Caravan routes, once funneled through Babylon, now bent toward Persian hubs, redirecting wealth and influence. The fall disrupted the delicate balance of power in the ancient Near East, catalyzing new conflicts and coalitions. And within Babylon, the loss was felt as both a rupture and an opportunity. Some elites sought favor with Persia, others retreated into nostalgia or rebellion. This geopolitical tremor echoed far beyond the city's walls, signaling the end of an era and the dawn of a new imperial order where Babylon, though diminished, remained a potent symbol of the past's enduring weight. Within the city's stone and clay, ordinary Babylonians wrestled with uncertainty and adaptation. Farmers, craftsmen, and traders who had once sung hymns to Marduk now found themselves subjects of a distant king who claimed divine favor through conquest. Some clung fiercely to traditions, lighting lamps in temples and whispering prayers to gods whose temples bore the marks of Persian restoration, yet felt strangely foreign. Others saw opportunity in the new order merchants who forged ties with Persian officials, artisans who crafted goods for imperial markets, or scribes who learned the language of the conquerors to secure positions in the new administration. Yet beneath these surface adaptations lay a deep psychological dissonance. The city's identity, once anchored in its myths of divine favor and imperial destiny, seemed to drift like sand caught in the river's current. Stories of Babylon's former glory circulated in taverns and markets, mingling with Persian tales and legends. The children grew up learning both worlds, but the tension between pride and submission haunted their elders. In this liminal space, the soul of Babylon teetered between preservation and transformation, resistance and accommodation. The city had not been destroyed by Cyrus's army, but by the quiet erosion of its people's belief in their own immortality. The fall was not just military, but existential. As decades passed, Babylon's name endured, etched in the chronicles of empires, and echoed in the lore of civilizations yet to come. Yet the city itself was no longer the unassailable heart of power it once had been. Under Persian rule, its grandeur softened into provincial dignity, a jewel in a vast imperial crown rather than its radiant center. Yet this decline was far from simple decay. It was a transformation shaped by political pragmatism and cultural resilience. Persian kings granted Babylon privileges to maintain loyalty, hosting grand festivals and restoring temples, ensuring that the city's sacred rites continued to bind its people to their heritage. However, the very act of restoration also cemented Persian dominance, as every stone reset and every ritual performed reinforced the supremacy of an empire that was no longer Babylonian. In this delicate balance, Babylon survived not as a lost world, but as a living palimpsest, with the layers of conquest and culture intertwined like the flowing rivers that sustained its soil. The city's fall, often told as a swift end, was in truth a slow, complex rebirth into a new historical identity, marked by sacrifice, adaptation, and an enduring legacy that would echo through millennia. But the story of Babylon's fall, and what history chose to ignore, extends beyond walls and kings to the moral and political dilemmas that still resonate today. The city's collapse was not simply the loss of power to a foreign invader. It was a profound reckoning with the limits of empire, faith, and identity. Nabonidus's religious reforms, though unpopular, were attempts to redefine Babylon's place in a changing world. The priesthood's resistance to these changes reflected a broader tension between tradition and innovation, a conflict as old as civilization itself. When Cyrus arrived, hailed as liberator by some and conqueror by others, Babylon's people faced a choice: to resist and risk annihilation, or to embrace a new order that promised peace but demanded submission. This moral ambiguity, the surrender of sovereignty for survival, the collaboration with conquerors for continuity, remains one of the most overlooked facets of Babylon's fall. It challenges modern assumptions about conquest and resistance, showing that history's grand narratives often mask the quiet, painful compromises made by individuals and societies. The fall of Babylon was not only a military event, it was a meditation on power's fragility and the human cost of empire. The legacy of Babylon's fall rippled far beyond its immediate aftermath, influencing empires and cultures for centuries to come. The Persian model of governance, combining tolerance with control, became a blueprint for future empires, most notably the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and later the Romans, who absorbed and adapted Persian strategies of administration and cultural integration. Babylon itself became a symbol, invoked both as a cautionary tale of hubris and a beacon of ancient wisdom. In Judeo-Christian traditions, Babylon morphed into an archetype of decadence and oppression, its fall interpreted through religious lenses that obscured its complex historical reality. Yet beneath these symbolic layers lay the real city, a place of human struggles, political intrigue, faith, and adaptation. The echoes of Babylon's fate remind us that history is often written by victors who shape the narrative to serve their ends. What was ignored, those betrayals, compromises, and cultural shifts, speaks to the fragile nature of power and the resilience of those who lived through its fall. Babylon's story, then, is not just ancient history, but a timeless reflection on the cycles of rise and decline, of memory and forgetting, that define human civilization. Archaeological discoveries in the modern era have further complicated our understanding of Babylon's fall and legacy. Excavations reveal layers of destruction and renewal, signs of Persian respect, alongside evidence of cultural displacement. Tablets unearthed in forgotten libraries contain voices previously silenced, administrators pleading for resources, priests lamenting lost influence, and commoners recounting the hardships of occupation. These fragmented testimonies challenge the neat narratives of swift conquest and benevolent rulership. They show a city struggling to maintain identity amid the pressures of empire. Moreover, recent scholarship has unearthed the stories of marginalized groups, women, slaves, artisans, whose lives were reshaped by the shifting political landscape. The fall of Babylon was not a singular moment, but a prolonged transformation felt in every corner of society. Each tablet, each ruin, is a candle flickering against the darkness of oblivion, illuminating the human cost behind imperial triumph. As historians piece together these fragments, the story of Babylon grows richer, more nuanced, a testament to the resilience of memory and the relentless quest to reclaim what history sought to forget. The myths surrounding Babylon's fall have endured as powerfully as the city itself, weaving themselves into the fabric of global culture and imagination. From the biblical Tower of Babel to apocalyptic visions in the Book of Revelation, Babylon became a symbol of human ambition, pride, and divine punishment. Artists, poets, and philosophers have long drawn on its imagery to explore themes of downfall and redemption. Yet these myths often obscure the complex reality behind the city's demise. They transform historical actors into archetypes. Babylon as the wicked city, Cyrus as the liberator, Belshazzar as the doomed ruler flattening rich human stories into moral fables. Understanding the true fall of Babylon demands peeling back these layers of symbolism to confront the raw, often contradictory truths beneath. It reveals a civilization grappling with change, struggling with faith, politics, and identity in ways that echo across time. Babylon's legacy challenges us to reconsider how history is told and remembered, reminding us that behind every myth lies a human story waiting to be heard. In the final centuries of Babylon's prominence, the city's place in the imperial narrative shifted again under successive rulers. The Greeks, led by Alexander the Great, would eventually claim Babylon as a prize, envisioning it as a gateway to the east and a symbol of universal power. Alexander's brief occupation brought new energy, but also new uncertainties. Plans to restore Babylon's grandeur were ambitious, but cut short by his untimely death, leaving the city in a fragile state between past glory and fading relevance. The Seleucid dynasty that followed sought to maintain control, yet they too faced growing local unrest and competing powers. Babylon, once a beacon of civilization, was caught between worlds Persian, Greek, and emerging Parthian forces, each imprinting their mark on its stones and stories. This liminal phase reflects the city's enduring resilience and vulnerability. Despite the political turmoil, Babylon remained a cultural and religious center, its temples and festivals continuing long after its political power waned. Its legacy, layered with conquest and survival, speaks to the persistent human endeavor to find meaning and identity amid the tides of empire and history. The fall of Babylon, often narrated as a moment of conquest, is in truth a profound meditation on the cycles of power, betrayal, and survival that define human history. This city, once the radiant heart of civilization, crowned with ziggurats that reached toward the heavens, did not simply vanish beneath Persian blades. It was a slow unspooling of identity, faith, and sovereignty. A complex dance where conqueror and conquered blurred into one another. The betrayal was not just by Cyrus or his generals, but by the fractures within Babylon itself, the priests who lost faith, the rulers who abandoned sacred duties, and a people caught between hope and despair. Babylon's fall teaches that the mightiest empires crumble not solely from without, but from within. Yet even in its decline, Babylon endured as a symbol of cautionary tale, a beacon of ancient wisdom, a palimpsest of memory etched into the very fabric of civilization. As the dust settles over those ancient bricks, one question lingers. In the grand sweep of history, how many other cities, peoples, and stories have been quietly erased, their truths ignored or forgotten? This is Candle and Coffin. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world.